Hello, you are listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer and Amazon #1 best-selling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Now, our guest today, Forrest Rivers, is a meditation teacher and author, and he has a very important message for you. And we're going to be talking about his book, COVID-19 and Humanity's Spiritual Awakening. You can find out more about Forrest Rivers and his life-changing work at his website, forrestrivers.com. Welcome, Forrest Rivers.
Hey, welcome. Thank you so much for having me today, Catherine.
Well, thank you so much for all you do. And I'm so happy that you wrote this book because during this time, when millions of people all over the planet have died, and there's just so much fear and despair and disruption and chaos and change, so many people, I think, have lost their way.
Mm.
And your message in your book is one that we all really need. So, Forrest Rivers, why did you write your book, COVID-19 and Humanity's Spiritual Awakening?
So, so the reason I wrote this book, Catherine, I started writing it actually during uh, the height of the pandemic. So, during my day job, I am a community college professor, and we all got sent home when the lockdowns went into effect. And all around me, I saw a lot of suffering. As we all are aware of. I had a lot of friends who were immediately out of work. I knew people who got COVID and were struggling with it. Um, there were You could feel all that anxiety and fear that we're probably all familiar with. If you didn't get COVID, you were worried that you were going to get it. If you were elderly, you were worried you could die from it. If you had pre-existing conditions, there were issues there. Then there were all the other questions. Will we ever get back to normal? Uh, how do we handle this period of isolation and all the mental health issues that brings to the table? And I just saw all this suffering around me, and I was like, wait a minute, there has to be a silver lining to all this, because as with any kind of spiritual growth, it usually uh, it's usually bolstered by suffering. Ram Dass, who's one of my most influential spiritual teachers, the late Ram Dass, he had said a great quote. He said, "Suffering is the sandpaper that awakens people." And so as I was writing this, I was thinking, I wrote the book as the pandemic was going on. So I started in March, finished it sometime around October, and
This is March
as
2020. And
March 2020. So I just saw all this suffering around me, and I was like, I really want to deliver a message that'll uplift people and inspire people and uh, shift the perspective a little bit from kind of like doom and gloom and fear, and frankly, to be honest, Catherine, like a kind of a more nihilistic mindset about everything, and shift that perspective to, hey, we have something right here that we can really work with. There's a lot that, despite all the very real suffering that this has caused, and it's caused a lot of very real suffering. I don't want to ever minimize that, because I think it's that suffering, but it's that suffering that's created the opportunity for what I would call, an awakening. And in the book, I talk about a number of ways in which we could we can work with this for our awakening.
this is such an important best message. Now, in my 10th book, Reading the Soul, I talk about what I call a breakdown to a breakthrough.
Yes.
So many times I think that we find ourselves sometimes and we think this is the hardest year of my life, or this is the biggest challenge that I think I've ever faced. And yet, as hard as those times are, they are often what I call a breakdown to a breakthrough. And when you kind of recognize you're at that point, it's like when you're really breaking down the structures of your life, your belief systems, everything that you thought was stable or real, then those are times, as you talk about, Forrest Rivers, some of those times are our greatest spiritual awakenings. Now, Forrest Rivers, you're a meditation teacher. And in your book, COVID-19 and Humanity's Spiritual Awakening, you talk about spiritual awakening. What exactly is a spiritual awakening?
Yeah. So obviously, well, first of all, I want to say I love what you just said about sort of like things need to break down in order to have that breakthrough, in order to have an awakening. And often those times that you're describing, the greatest times of struggle and suffering, create the opportunities for awakening. And for me, the way I look at an awakening kind of is um, a greater realization of your interconnectedness to the whole,
Mhm.
uh, uh, popping the illusion of separateness, that you think that you're just this separate being, uh, you know, accidentally here, somehow disjointed and disconnected. And that awakening part comes in when, no, wait a minute, I'm part of something much vaster, much greater, a transcendent whole that you're a part of. And I think when I think of awakening, I think of that coming to oneness, coming to see yourself from a separate identity to part of something, a vast cosmic web. That's
That's
how I look at it.
That's a beautiful definition. Now, when I do medical intuitive reading, sometimes I also do what I call a soul reading. And one of the things that I look at is, are you unconscious? And what I mean by that is maybe you're not aware of yourself as a soul. You haven't realized your soul purpose. You're just going through the motions of your life. And then we go through these periods of awakening, and then we're conscious. It's like, wait, I'm a soul. I have a purpose. There's a reason I'm alive at this time.
I'm not just this body. I'm not just the physical runoff of all these currents in my life, but I'm identified with the soul. The soul is within the body, and the body, rather than being the nexus point of our entire existence, the body is the temple that's housing the true point of our existence, which is our soul, that I would argue reincarnates, every life. It takes a body to work out its past karma. It's here. And that's where, and when you, and part of that awakening is when you start to identify with the soul. Now, you still honor the body, because without the body, the soul can't get on with its work. The soul is in its temple, if you, the body is its temple, if you will. But that awakening comes when you start identifying with your soul. And when you identify with your soul, you realize it's deathless, it's eternal. And that soul is part of something that's so vast and so great. And when you identify with the soul, you can't help but realize how interconnected you are to everything, right? It's that soul awareness.
So, Forrest Rivers, author of COVID-19 and Humanity's Spiritual Awakening, I love that part of your definition of a spiritual awakening is this awareness of our interconnectedness.
Yes.
And I think that for me as a medical intuitive, I remember I started writing about the pandemic and writing blogs to help people get through this. And I wrote about the metaphysical meaning of coronavirus.
Oh,
And
beautiful.
to me as a medical intuitive, anytime you have a virus, that's a call for a change in consciousness. So a virus, whatever kind of virus you have, it's your soul tapping you on the shoulder saying you need to change the way you're thinking about things. And There's, for one thing, this illness, this disease, this global pandemic has shown us is how actually connected we really are.
Gosh,
Yeah.
in so many ways, right, Catherine? That's inspiring that you've been writing about that. And this virus has without a doubt showed us all the ways in which we are connected, whether it's just the mere fact of the existence of this virus, that nobody is immune from it. Everybody, it's literally uh, transversing itself around the world. You can look at the most basic assumption of that. Another way that we saw how interconnected we are was when we all went on to lockdown. We saw the impact of the lockdown on our suffering that we were all experiencing in common. We were all struggling with the isolation. We were all struggling with the mental health aspects. We were struggling with not getting on with our quote normal life. We became aware of, when we were in lockdown, we saw the positive impacts on the environment. People in India were able to see the mountains for the first time in areas that hadn't been able to see the Himalayas. So we saw the collective impact of even our activity and the way it influenced the earth. Uh, we saw the interconnectedness we have with our Native American tribes, who have with our indigenous tribes, who have suffered greatly during this entire time. Any way you cut it, this brought that interconnectedness, that soul awareness of our natural state of oneness to the forefront.
Now, Forrest Rivers, meditation teacher. So, in your work as a meditation teacher, you're teaching people how to connect with their soul. How
Yes.
can COVID-19 be used to awaken?
Oh, wow. Thank you. I'm so happy you asked that question, Catherine. Numerous ways. So one that immediately comes to mind, which is at the forefront of all meditation practices, particularly in the Buddhist faith and the Hindu faith. Actually, to be more accurate, in the whole Eastern faith, period, whether we're talking Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, whatever we're talking, is overcoming our fear of death. This has been an important opportunity for us to work with death. It's in our face now. We turn on the TV, we put on the internet, we see immediately casualty figures. We hear reports of hospitalizations. Now we're going through this whole process about vaccines, so we don't have to be in the hospital. We don't have to risk dying, right? So death, that theme, is constantly in our faces now. And this has been an important time to develop a spiritual practice through prayer, through meditation, to come to terms with death. What does that actually mean when we die? What does that mean? Is that an end? Is it a passage? I believe it's a passage. Is it finality? Can't be, right? It can't be just the end all, right? There has to be, if you have the soul awareness, it's more like the Hindus have a great term. They call it dropping the body, right? Which insinuates that something is dropping the body, the soul, and it continues on. So this has been a wonderful time to work with our fears and our anxiety about death. That's one thing. That's one way this has helped us awaken. Another way is uh, is if we're identified with the soul, then we should be seeking things that meaningfully connect us to that interconnected whole, to the oneness. So, one thing I talk a lot about in the book is this pandemic has been an important opportunity for deepening our practice of seeking soul enriching activities that connect us to oneness. So, one thing I've seen a lot of, particularly from some of my friends and some of the characters I talk about in this book, is during this time, many have expressed interest to explore the more meaningful, interconnected aspects of life. For example, people taking up gardening, people getting outside in nature more. I can't tell you how many people, Catherine, I've met who have said during this time, man, now that I don't have to sit at the office all day, and now that I'm not having, I had this period where I was away from work, you know, wow, like maybe I should be spending more time in nature. That's meaningful and that connects it. Maybe I should spend more time doing art and music and cultivating my creative side. And of course, the arts and music, the getting out in nature and gardening, uh, living more sustainably with nature, those are all things that intuitively connect us deeper to the soul, right? And so I think a lot of people have had, I know myself included, like definitely, you're looking at this event and you're like, this is a real opportunity to kind of live more intentionally, more mindfully, and in a way that fosters that connection. So, off the top of my head, just helping us overcome our fear of death, and then the uh, uh, helping us reflect. This period has helped us awaken in the sense that we're reflecting more deeply about how we want to live in greater connection with that whole.
Beautiful message. In my book, Reading the Soul, I talk about what I refer to as soul medicine. So just
Yes.
as, here we are in the natural healing show, and we talk about different natural healing remedies, whether it be supplements or flower essences or herbs.
Yes.
And just like, different people may need different herbs at different times, depending on what's going on with their health, all of us, because you are unique, you're not just biochemically unique, you're vibrationally unique.
Yes.
Just like you have a thumbprint, Forrest and I are different people. We're both nice people. We have unique energies. And you also, in my view, as a medical intuitive, will have what I call unique kinds of soul medicine that work
Yes.
best for you. So part of what I look at is when I'm doing a soul reading, what kinds of soul medicine, and you mentioned several of them: spending time in nature, gardening, creative activities, hugs. So any
Meditation practice.
meditation practice, prayer, spiritual reading, anything, any activities, in my view, that really feed your soul and allow you to connect to your soul and allow you to connect to this greater awareness of
Yes.
this power of oneness that's all around us, that supports us all the time.
Absolutely. And more when you're connected to that whole through the soul medicine you're speaking about. We all know the soul and your physical health are directly linked together.
Yes.
Uh, you know,
And because in my view, I talk about the 5 levels of healing: the physical body, the energy body, the emotional, mental, and spiritual. And because you are a soul having a human experience, whenever you apply soul medicine and you lift your vibration, that's going to have a profound effect on your whole well-being. So it's the most powerful level to do healing work on is at that soul level. Now,
so good to hear that. Yes.
Forrest Rivers, how can people embrace suffering in a positive way? Because there really has been a tremendous amount of suffering during this time.
Oh man, there has, without a doubt, whatever way you cut it, been a substantial amount of suffering. And we've mentioned many of those ways in which people have suffered, whether it's job layoffs, loss of loved ones, homelessness. Um, in the case, like I mentioned before, and I talk about in the book, the loss of indigenous wisdom with the death of many tribal elders. Whichever way you cut it, there's no denying the amount of suffering. But One way we can work with it, we can turn it into positive, is a simple shift of our perspective. And we all have the power at any given time to meet. We don't really have control over if the suffering is happening. I would argue many times when we suffer, it's kind of part of our karmic path, right? It's something that we kind of intuitively signed up for before we took form in this body. But how we meet that suffering, we always have control. And it's always a quick shift of perspective. You can either use that suffering and drown yourself in your sorrow, or you can use the suffering for an opportunity of growth. Now, that's easier said than done. And I acknowledge that is more than easier said than done. But simply shifting our practice, uh, anchoring ourselves in the heart soul, rather than allowing our mind to run rampant. And that's where meditation comes in. I can't emphasize enough, to answer your question, how important cultivating a meditation, or if you prefer a prayer practice, is to being able to alter that perspective in a more positive mindset. I think that is actually crucial, because how we meet suffering depends on what's going on here and our control of up here. Uh, I heard a great quote. I don't know where it came from, but it says, the mind is a wonderful servant, but a terrible master, right? So the idea is, when you allow, it might have been Eckhart who said that, but when the mind basically is just, a purveyor of great suffering, it, it uh,
It's
grasps.
constantly judging.
It's constantly, yes, thank you, Catherine. It's constantly judging, it's grasping, it's refusing to accept what is in any given moment. It's constantly projecting. And, and that was actually, what I'm saying is not wholly original. I mean, that was Buddha's entire second noble truth, that the cause of all suffering is essentially our grasping and attachment to that suffering, and our unwillingness to um, our unwillingness to accept what is. And so again, I'd say the key to shifting to a positive perspective: meditation practice, mindfulness, anchoring yourself in a reservoir of inner faith. But you can't get there, that reservoir of inner faith, until you remove all that cloud of uh, what I just call mind debris. You have to clear that.
Yes. Now, one of the biggest kinds of suffering that we collectively experienced on a global level during the pandemic was not just illness and death, but also loneliness.
Oh, yes.
And how can embracing a spiritual practice empower us to overcome the suffering of loneliness?
Yeah, absolutely. So, uh, study after study has revealed that during this pandemic, uh, mental health problems have escalated as a result of people's dire feelings of isolation. And I think, that's a difficult question to answer. How do you overcome that loneliness? I could give you a couple explanations, but again, it's easier said than done. When you start cultivating that soul awareness and you start quieting the mind, you start naturally shifting your perspective of that period in solitude. So rather than that solitude being a source of suffering and isolation, suddenly that time you're spending more alone is being used for your own, consciously, for your own spiritual growth. So you're shifting your perspective even of solitude, of what that means. Um, there was a really interesting study back in the day. Uh, so Ram Dass and Stephen Levine, I mentioned Ram Dass earlier, two very influential late teachers, they started a prison ashram project where they would go into the prisons and they would work with prisoners who were expressing the same, obviously, feelings of isolation and loneliness for obvious reasons. They're in prison, they're detached from friends, they're detached from families. It's pretty easy to dehumanize prisoners, but they're still people. So they went in there and they started saying, well, hey, this is all perspective. The isolation you're feeling is real, that sense of suffering you're getting from it. But through meditation, let's reorient the way you're looking at this loneliness. Many people spend thousands of dollars to go on retreats every year, to be alone and to be able to work on themselves and to contemplate and to self-reflect. And when they went into the prisons, Ram Dass and Stephen Levine would say, hey, like, there's a real opportunity here for growth. People pay to do essentially what you're doing. And so I think, again, it's reorienting our perspective on what the aloneness means. And I would also add to that, when you start cultivating that greater soul awareness and you start realizing your interconnectedness to everything, and you start acknowledging intuitively that there is an underlying reality we're all part of, this mysterious, spontaneous, yet almost like remarkable order and intelligence to it too. You can call it God, oneness, absolute being, whatever term you're comfortable using. When you come to that awareness, you're never alone. You're never alone. That there's, now, in terms of more practically, how do we overcome that kind of aloneness? Well, I think the importance of Sangha and spiritual communities. I did talk. There was a wonderful writer. I write for this one collective called the Mindful Word, and they're based out of Canada. And they have a beautiful writer named Max Reef, and he's elderly, so incredibly wise. And he shared some techniques on how to deal with the loneliness. And he started holding, he described how at the height of the pandemic, through Zoom, what we're using right now, every Sunday morning, him and a community of fellow worshipers, 20 or so, would gather on Zoom and they would chant together and they would pray together. So even during this period of like alienation, there's still there, albeit it's better in person, of course, right? But there's still opportunities to connect through these types of platforms, to have that sangha or community.
So for our audience, I'll just share a practice that I've been doing that's
Sure.
really been quite transformational.
Please.
So for years, I have meditated and prayed and done breath work. And literally the moment I opened my eyes, I start praying and meditating and doing breath work. And like everyone else during the pandemic, I found myself feeling much more stressed than usual. I didn't like isolation and lockdowns. So, another practice that I've been a huge proponent of for decades is a loving kindness meditation.
It's my favorite. Yep.
So, what I did, and this is a spiritual practice that if you're listening, you can do for free anytime, anywhere, was I identified 5 men and 5 women in my life who are, I'm just going to call them my tribe. I'm going to call them my spiritual family. I feel that these are special beings that, have been placed in my life. I love them. They love me. Some of them are around me. Some of them live in other countries. And what I began to do was I began to do a loving kindness meditation for each person. So if you're not familiar with loving kindness, it's very simple and it goes like this. So I'm going to do it for Forrest. May Forrest Rivers be well and free from illness. May Forrest Rivers be happy. May Forrest Rivers be well and free from illness. May Forrest Rivers be safe and free from harm. May Forrest Rivers be happy. May Forrest Rivers be at peace. So, what I started to do during lockdown was I would do this loving kindness meditation for each person in my spiritual family. And as I do this, I focus my awareness on this person. And as I practice this, and I would do this twice a day, even though I was isolated from these people, I at the same time I would feel incredibly connected in an incredibly heart opening, loving way, so that I never felt alone. And it actually helped me overcome tremendous loneliness. And I still do this practice every day. And what I notice is I focus on each person. And of course, I'm a medical intuitive. I feel their energy, I feel what's happening. And
Unbelievable.
I'm sending them love and light. And again, for our audience, you think of the person. May this person be
Yep.
well and free from illness. May this person be safe and free from harm. May this person be happy. May this person be at peace. And it's a very, very simple practice. And you wish them well. Yes.
It's incredibly powerful practice. I wanted to say thank you for sharing that. I actually have an entire section in the book that talks about the power of loving kindness and how we can use loving kindness to get through this pandemic. We must be like completely on the same path right now. That was actually introduced to me by my first meditation teacher years back, Dave Smith, and and loving kindness can not only help with isolation, but it also has been linked in studies to literally, this blew my mind, Catherine. There was a study done in Jerusalem and Lebanon during the height of the wars back in the 80s, and they would bring circles of 50 to 100 people, and everybody would gather and uh, do what you just did, send loving kindness to everybody involved in this struggle and the wars.
Mm.
And every time they did this study, there was a ceasefire that immediately followed these mass loving kindness. They call them meta circles, and it was just absolutely astounding. So it's literally what you're talking about, Catherine. Not only intuitively, you could feel that connection, but it's even been proven by science to have like incredibly resonating effects vibrationally.
Forrest Rivers, you're the professional meditation teacher. Can you share for our audience, because what a traditional loving kindness meditation is? Because I'm kind of doing a special one where I'm really focusing on people, but share with our audience more about loving kindness meditation, where it comes from, and how they can use that spiritual practice in their life.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Catherine, your demonstration for everybody was fantastic. I have nothing to add to it. It was beautiful, and that's something that all your viewers and listeners can do every day. So first of all, I want to say there was absolutely nothing wrong with your variation. It was fantastic. Um, and it actually came from the Theravadan Buddhist tradition. And they call it metta practice, which just means, like, as you said, loving kindness. And uh, really the idea is really to cultivate your like heart mind awareness, not mind heart mind. And the
Mhm.
idea is that if you can cultivate that sense of connection and loving kindness here, eventually your mind becomes clear as the ocean, right? It becomes very clear, and your thoughts become loving kindness, your heart becomes loving kindness, and the two become interlocked. It literally changes your entire psychology in the entire process. But yeah, it comes from the Theravada Buddhist tradition, and uh, the uh, Buddhist practitioners have been practicing this for thousands of years, and they argue that this literally has the power to transform individuals from the inside out, and that if you want to understand how real change in the world is made, it's made through cultivating loving kindness within ourselves first. We can't have social change. We can't correct all of our problems in the world until we cultivate that loving kindness within ourselves first. And it was, and so it comes from Buddhism. It comes from the Theravadan tradition, and it's considered an imperative practice in Buddhism. So, and it's best practice for, as you said before, you could do it once, twice a day. Uh, the best sittings are usually between 15 and 20 minutes. Uh, uh, when I send light during your practice, when you send light to those 5 men and 5 women, I like to picture either a clear white light of, as I'm saying, may all beings be at peace, may all beings be free from mental suffering, may all beings be well. As I'm saying those things, I'm picturing a clear white light or a pink light, whatever you associate with like love and compassion. You're on the in breath, you're breathing that light in from the universe, and then on the out breath, it's going out to those beings that you're thinking of. So I like to always picture a light, a clear white light or a pink light involved as well.
I do that as well. And in my mind's eye, when I'm finished, when I see each person and they're completely surrounded by white light, then I know that I've done my best to send them, just, beautiful energy. And, Forrest Rivers, so many people, because I'm a medical intuitive healer, they ask me, well, how do I open my intuition? And when I wrote my second book, What is Healing? Awaken Your Intuition for Health and Happiness. When I started to write that book, I only had one thought that I wanted to get across, which is when you learn to love unconditionally, you will know whatever it is that you need to know.
Yes.
And so as we cultivate this practice of loving kindness, and for me, as I pray for each person, I can literally feel their energy.
Yes.
Like I can kind of sense what's going on with them, even if I haven't spoken to that person for weeks.
That's how that's what you're describing, Catherine. That's how that results when you've done that practice for a while and you become more advanced at it. And by advanced, I mean anybody can become advanced at it. But what you're describing is, you've clearly gone pretty far in this practice to be able to, when you could start feeling how the people that you're directing that energy to is feeling themselves, you've crossed that threshold into not two but one. You are one at that point, and I think that's the whole point of the practice.
Yeah.
You break down that barrier between self and other.
Yeah. And, just and kind of the way I explain it is if you were an athlete, then maybe you would work out and eat a certain way in order to be able to do your sport. To be able to work as a professional medical intuitive healer, my prayer and meditation practice is part of that. So that you can just immediately connect in a non-judgmental, loving way, offering whatever, someone needs to know in any given moment. Now, Forrest Rivers, author of COVID-19 and Humanity's Spiritual Awakening, obviously you have a heartfelt desire to uplift the world and others at this time. What message do you have for our audience that's going to uplift them and give them the spiritual strength to continue to move forward during this time, which continues to be challenging for many people?
You can all get through this. This is a time of to cultivate hope and faith and not to despair. That this period is an important opportunity to grow in our awareness. COVID didn't appear as some kind of accident or fluke. I would argue that it had some kind of deeper meaning to jolt us out of our complacency, to jolt us out of our illusion of separateness, to jolt us out of our conditioned patterns of fear and paranoia, and this is one of our light posts, a big light post, to unify, to come together, and to inspire others. So my message for everybody is don't lose hope, don't lose faith while it looks bleak, while it looks dark. Light comes out of the darkness. And that's really my message out of all this. Don't despair. See this as part of our, just like we talked about evolution with science, this is part of our soul's evolution to overcome this period of collective suffering. And I truly believe that. And it's actually saddened me a little bit to see. Uh, I had an, I had a brief appearance as an author of the month for a particular website that I was working for, and I got a lot of people writing me on Facebook saying, on social media saying, this is a period of darkness. I don't see any positive coming out of this. And my thoughts were to say, you just got to tune within a little bit, quiet the mind, tune out from the outer channels telling you to have fear and telling you to despair. Tune in right here and ask your soul what it thinks about this period. And it'll admit that this is a difficult time, but that all difficult times arise in order to jolt us out of our sense of separateness and into taking a leap, a quantum leap of faith into our interconnected oneness, soul awareness. So don't lose hope, don't lose faith.
Forrest Rivers, author of COVID-19 and Humanity's Spiritual Awakening. Many years from now, when we look back on COVID-19, do you think we will see this as a turning point for humanity's evolution?
I sincerely believe deep down in my soul, Catherine, that when we look back at this 20, 30, 40 years from now, and we're able to take a step back and remove ourselves from like just our 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 pure ego minds, and we can see this from afar, we will look at this as one of the most important light posts that we had in our awakening, that this was a critical juncture for us to see how interconnected we truly are. And I think when we look back on it, if we're looking at it from an intuitive eye rather than just in a pragmatic eye, or if we're able to take a deeper look at this from a deeper level, from the unfolding of human consciousness perspective, we're going to see this as a very significant turning point for humanity. And right now, it may appear that we've maybe failed our test. Maybe we think that this is all, we point to all of the various things and say, nah, this isn't really going to have much of an impact. I would say give that thought some time. And when we look back, 25, 30, 40 years down the road, we'll see that there were some significant changes from a soul perspective that came out of this. By the way, I would say too, Catherine, to the audience and to your listeners, many times we don't see the physical world change at all until we see that first lighting of the soul within, right? So all the physical world is a manifestation of the spiritual. Everything comes out of the spiritual world. So right now it's easy to say, well, we don't really see any significant change happening because we're looking at the physical first. The soul is the thing we should be looking at. And right now we're seeing an awakening that has been happening for a while. And this is just the latest event that's sparking that awakening a little bit further. And when we look back at that, I think it will be hard to say that this wasn't a significant turning point.
I think certainly when we recognize that when I make choices about my health and whether to wear a mask or not to wear a mask, to get vaccinated or not vaccinated, to how I take care of my garden where they pour toxic chemicals on my garden,
Yep.
how I take care of the people around me. I think it's going to help us to really understand how every choice that we make affects literally everyone and everything around us.
100%. In fact, Catherine, I'd say that is one of the most profound statements I've heard in this entire interview, is you saying that right there. Every choice we make matters. On the deeper spiritual plane, our choices have consequences. And every kind or malicious act you make has consequences. Your life is a precious opportunity to build good karma. So live accordingly. And that's a message. And that message is meant to inspire. It's not to say if you act in a wrong, with wrong intent or wrong action, that you're suddenly doomed. We all do that, and I do that, and but it's to say this is a good time to become aware of the far-reaching consequences of your thoughts, your intentions, and your actions. Because if we're all one interconnected whole, all of that matters.
Very inspiring information. You've been listening to Forrest Rivers, meditation teacher and author of COVID-19 and Humanity's Spiritual Awakening. You can find out more about Forrest Rivers and his very important work at his website, forrestrivers.com. You've been listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 best-selling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. And remember, when you connect to healthy spiritual practices, you can find yourself transforming loneliness, anxiety, depression naturally, and coming to feel deeply connected to all that is in a very loving way. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.